Alignment matters. Earlier this week, I posted something on our congregational Facebook group for asking for examples of times when alignment matters in both good and bad ways. A simple one was your suspension and your steering of your car has an alignment, and your headlights. And when those are all aligned properly, it makes steering your car a whole lot easier. Somebody else talked about their spine not being totally aligned and the amount of pain and struggle that had created. Much of the examples were about the alignment of people. If you work in an organization where there's a clear direction and policies and all that goes with that makes it easy for everyone to head in that direction, then that alignment is a positive thing. If you work someplace where that's not all clear, it can be hard to get work done. One person works in supply chain logistics and talked about how wonderful it is when everything lines up, and then how challenging it is when something makes that alignment more difficult. But not all alignment is positive. One person talked about when it seems like everything is aligned, where everything seems to be lined up, but some voices have been quieted because they don't feel safe to share their opinions or to open up and ask questions, so that it can seem like there's alignment, but some people are left out. And then there's the alignment that happens when everybody gets behind the bully or the dictator. Whether that's self-preservation or seeking to share in power, when you get behind that kind of alignment, people can do some terrible things because they're aligned in the wrong way. Alignment matters. Today we hear from the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus starts that with the Beatitudes, and then last week we heard that he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And today we get this little series of commandments that he gives, looking back at what people have been told and reframing that a bit, probably to talk about how he is fulfilling the law. I have to tell you that as a preacher, this feels like a choose-your-own-adventure that's all totally perilous. Do we want to talk about divorce, or do we want to talk murder and anger? Do we want to talk about adultery? Like, we can just pick one. But I was really struck by the last bit of the passage. He gets around to talking about oaths and says, don't swear by heaven, don't swear by God, don't swear by your head, don't swear by your mother's grave, do not swear. Just let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. I think what Jesus is saying is when you say yes, mean yes, and act that way, and when you say no, mean no, and act that way, and we might call that integrity. Now, the dictionary has a couple of parts of a definition for integrity. One of them is sort of honest living with principles and sort of being morally upright. The other one, though, is about being whole. If you think of a bridge, when we build a bridge, if we put all the pieces in there, we would say that the bridge has structural integrity. Take some pieces out, it loses structural integrity. So this dictionary definition is not bad, but I think part of what Jesus is doing in this text is giving us a much deeper definition of what integrity should look like for us. The first bit, he says, you've heard it said, do not murder. Murder's an action. He says, I say don't even get angry. Angry is something internal to us, right? And then he says, don't call somebody a fool, don't insult other people. Those are words. So we've got an action, we've got something that's sort of in our heart, in ourself, and then words. And Jesus is maybe saying that those things tend to line up. So if you have a bitterness in your heart, that may come out in your words, and then that bitterness, when those things are lined up, will probably come out in your actions as well. But I don't think Jesus is saying that it only goes in one direction. Sometimes we talk about ourselves or about other people in ways that starts to shape the way we think. If you say enough bad things about yourself, sooner or later you're going to start to believe it. And if we say enough bad things about other people, we'll start to think of them as less than fully human in the way that we hope to be ourselves. Also, sometimes we act in certain ways, whether it's from peer pressure or what you're supposed to do at work, and somebody makes you cut the corners, and pretty soon you start to talk in those same ways, and maybe that starts to internalize as well. So we can go in any direction. And I think what Jesus is saying is that our hearts and our words and our actions all tend to get lined up. And so we need to be careful about that. He also talks about what it is we're looking at, right? He says, you've heard it said, not to commit adultery. I say, even if you look, right? That's where is your focus. So if you add that into the mix, we've got what it is that's going on inside of us. We got the words that we speak, the things that we do, but also where we put our focus. Where we pay attention to tends to draw, right, some of our action and get us lined up with that. So he's lining up all of this parts of who we are. Inside, words, focus, action. Now, all of that can be lined up in a way that isn't really healthy. If you carry some of that meanness and you focus on negativity and speak that meanness and act in that way, there is a sort of integrity to that. At least you're consistent, right? But then Jesus gives us some other stuff to add to this alignment to get outside of ourselves. He says, you've heard it said that you can issue a woman a certificate of divorce. Now in Jesus' day, there were certain people that were much, much more vulnerable than everyone else. You hear a lot in the prophets about widows and about orphans. And a woman that got granted a certificate of divorce and cast out would have been a vulnerable person. So I hear Jesus saying, your words, your heart, your focus, your action can all be aligned, but it also needs to be aligned with God's vision that nobody is left out. God's vision that everybody has life, that everybody is valued. That takes that alignment that we may have and aligns it then with who God is calling us to be. Now there's one more bit. Do we stay aligned really well all the time? No. So Jesus says if you're going to make your offering, right, before you get to the altar, if you remember that someone has something against you, meaning you have spoken badly about them or done something that hurt them, then go and get reconciled. Go and make that right. It's an acknowledgement that our hearts and our words and our focus and our actions are not always perfectly aligned. That sometimes we do get out of alignment and do things we maybe did not want to do or said things we should not have said. So part of that gospel integrity that lines all of that up with God is for us to be able to say, I'm sorry, ask for forgiveness, acknowledge the places where we have gotten out of line and the things that we have done that we should not have done. So all of this comes together, right? Our hearts are lined up with our words, our focus, our actions, all of that lined up with God's vision and God's call to us as people of faith. And when we fail at that, we have mechanisms to ask for forgiveness and to offer forgiveness so that everything can kind of try to live in that space of alignment. So I want to take a second now and ask you to think about someone that you trust with anything. Someone that you trust deeply. Hopefully you have a person like that. Think about someone who you would think has integrity. Maybe somebody that's a mentor or somebody that inspires you. When I think about those people in my life that fit those two descriptions, they are generally people who say what they mean. They mean what they say, but they don't just say anything because they can. They're mindful that other people are around and that there's a kindness and a love that goes with the way we speak. They do what they say they're going to do. They keep their promises. And when they mess up, they apologize. These also happen to be the people who tell me the truth even when I don't want to hear it, but they always do that with love. They don't just say it because they know it's true. They say it in a way that helps build up, not in a way that tears down. And my experience of these people fits this sort of picture that Jesus gives us. Their hearts are generally lined up with their words, which is generally lined up in what they pay attention to, and is almost always lined up with the gospel's call for our lives. And they happen to be people that carry a profound, to me, sense of peace. These are people that have an integrity of wholeness. Because they're all lined up generally, and because that's lined up with Jesus, as they live their lives, they are at peace. They're not fighting against themselves and constantly trying to figure out how to make sense of the world, because much of that sits in that space of alignment. Now, even as you think about who those people are, I fear that our culture has lost all value of integrity as a virtue. And actually, most virtues probably. When I look at our collective life that we share together, our commerce isn't just run through with integrity that lines up with Jesus. And I say that for myself. I don't, in all of my purchasing, go and try to figure out if everything was sourced in ways that is good for the world and made by people who are paid well and distributed and everything else in ways that honor our people and our environment. It's just way easier to buy the stuff, right? And so then my action isn't always lined up with the way that I would hope that I am acting and where my heart is, right? And so that's a challenge to me. But also, if you look at our public discourse, it's easy to point at our politicians and say, all of that is not aligned with the way Jesus calls us to talk and act and be. But I spend enough time on social media, and I'm social media friends with some of you all, to know that we don't live in that space either, right? We elect those people, and we talk very much in the same ways that they talk to one another. So this idea that our words and our hearts and our focus and our action should all be aligned with Jesus is something that we sometimes in our day-to-day struggle to keep up with. Now, I would bet that some of you here are old enough that you would tell me that it didn't used to be that way. Except for Jesus said this a really long time ago. And I bet if you go back to when you said it didn't used to be that way, there was a lot of stuff that was out of line. You just kept it quiet so nobody knew, right? So Jesus spoke these words knowing that as human beings, we would struggle to keep all that in line. Struggle to have our hearts and our focus in the right places and to have our words and our actions reflect this love that God calls us to carry into the world. So the good news is we're not in charge of keeping ourselves in line, right? Jesus does that. And if you look at the way he comes into the world, and especially you see this in the Gospel of Luke, there's a point where he turns and puts his focus on Jerusalem. He knows where all that stuff is supposed to align. And even as he walks around, he gets not distracted, right? But people shout out and he kind of takes these little turns, but they're always in line with his way of being. It's always a response out of love, a response out of compassion, even if it's a challenge to someone. When he ends up in a conversation with Pilate, does Pilate seem like he's lined up with the gospel? No. And even Pilate is like, hey, I don't want to execute this guy. I'm going to wash my hands of it. He was perfectly happy to crucify people. That was part of his thing, right? So right in front of him is Jesus, who's perfectly aligned with God's vision for the world, and then Pilate is not, and Jesus ends up getting put on the cross. But it's on that cross that he starts to fulfill all of these promises, right? That God is going to swallow up the shroud of death forever. That God is going to draw all people into reconciliation. Jesus meets us at the cross where we fail at staying aligned. And then when the resurrection comes, he raises up to this new place to free us from all of that which keeps us from staying aligned and to invite us into a way of living that really is a place of peace. When you hear this text, it may sound like it's a bar too high for us to get to, right? You've heard it said, don't do these terrible things, then raising the bar a little bit. But as I asked you to imagine people that you know, you probably thought of people that do a pretty good job at that. Which means that Jesus works in us to align us, to get us to those places where we can live in that space of life and of freedom. A couple of ways that is much more practical. As a congregation, we have some guiding statements. We have a mission, we have a purpose, we have vision, and we have values. Did we make those disconnected from Scripture? I hope not, right? But we hold those out, and hopefully those are a guide for us. Now, there's something interesting about this passage. It has two different, my grammar's not great, two different persons. Some of it's in second person, plural, and some of it's singular. So when Jesus says, you have heard it said, that's plural, which I think in the South is all y'all. So it's all y'all have heard it said. But when it turns to the parts of more individual responsibility, like cut out your eye if it causes you to sin, or go make amends with your neighbor, that's in singular. So Jesus is talking at two levels to the whole of a community to say you all need to be aligned, and we as individuals need to work at our alignment. And so part of the call for this text is for us to really tend to our words and tend to our actions and tend to our hearts and tend to what we pay attention to, trusting that in that Jesus is going to line us up with God's love. But then as a congregation, we have these visions and values that guide us. One of those values is integrity. That we as a congregation will do what we say we are going to do and say what we mean and believe, and that our collective life will reflect all of that. That's hugely important. Does the world have a positive vision of the church? Not always, right? Because sometimes the church doesn't live in that space. So we have that value there, and we keep that vision and those values in front of us to help try to keep us aligned. The other thing that is, I think, quite practical in this text, we are getting ready in a few minutes to celebrate communion. What do we do before that? We do pray. What else? The peace. Jesus says, if you remember before you come to bring your offering that someone has something against you, go and make things right. Sometimes I think we forget and we think the peace is just a greeting that we're like, hey, how you doing? Good morning, haven't seen you in a couple weeks, right? The peace is actually a place for us to practice this reconciliation, to practice it with one another. Now, you may not have someone in this room today that you remember has something against you, right? And that's okay, because we still practice reconciliation. We practice it for one another, and we practice it on behalf of our community and the whole of the world. So that as we come up to this table and gather around this font, we are practicing that alignment in this place so that our hearts and our words and our focus and our actions can be aligned with God's love. And when we practice that here, we get better at it so that we can take it out into the world. And as we go out into a world where integrity isn't necessarily a thing, we can carry this gospel integrity with us. And if we carry it with us, will people notice? They will, right? When we're all aligned and that alignment is with God's love, not only will they notice that that's aligned for us, but hopefully they will experience then God's love. And it will be something that draws them in and touches them with grace and teaches them something that begins to shape and change them in the ways that hopefully we are always being shaped and changed. So as we gather this day and we share that peace, live in that space of reconciliation, trust that God is working to always line us up and send us out so that all people might be whole and well in the integrity of Jesus as we go. Amen.